of all people, Arini said something that got me thinking about some other things. He was talking about a woman who was doing the Kickstarter for her trip to some country. She's a middle-aged woman, wanted to kickstart her trip to some country, some poor country, where she would build houses for people. Now, this is obviously an inefficient, like, why would you fly a middle-aged woman to this country to help these people? Why? And to build houses, why that in particular? Right? It doesn't seem to be thought out in terms of best way to use that money to help these people, right? It really doesn't seem to be, that doesn't seem to be the end there. And you could say, well, this person is just really, really, really stupid. Oh, maybe. I think it's more complicated than that. I think it's more that this going to this country to help these people herself is a religious passage. It's more of an ideological thing. You could say warm fuzzies, maybe. But I would like to relate this to, and certainly I have no doubt that there are warm fuzzies, but I would like to relate this to a mission trip, when religious people do this. I used to think mission trips were not really good things. Now I think they're a waste of resources, and it's basically for people to feel that they are doing God's work. It's a waste of resources. It's work that you do that you're not particularly good at, right? So it's wasteful work. It's waste of money for the traveling. It's really, like, you travel, you spend all that money on that round trip plane ticket just so you could go there for a week. It's colossally wasteful in that regard. So, and of course the point of that is not to help these people. If like, nowhere in the planning of these mission trips did we go, well, wait a minute. Let's look at the problems that these people face, and let's try to figure out how we're going to help them. Nowhere does that discussion ever happen, okay? Because that's not the point of the mission trip. The point of the mission trip is for the people going on the trip, right? It is what it does for them. It is a religious passage, right? The Bible says, help poor, downtrodden, blah, blah, blah. Find some passages that say that, right? But that's, well, whether the Bible says that or contradicts it, or who cares? That's what the church says. That's what the Christian belief is. Okay, that's what we believe the Bible says, right? Which is more important than what the Bible actually says. So that's what we believe the Bible says, so we go there and we do that. And we get warm fuzzies, and we believe we're doing God's work, right? And so I think back to two more things. The religious origin of the state. Now, every state that formed de novo. Now, I haven't analyzed every single state going up to when you started to have secular justifications for states. But talking about BC, all states BC. Somebody's going to find some counterexample, I know. Had a religious justification. They were all justified, or claimed to be justified, by God. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that that's how they came about. I personally believe that Egypt, that the city-states of Egypt, the city-states of Babylon, the local states in Mesoamerica, of course these states then congealed into single larger states in time, but all these states that formed de novo formed out of religious cults, not through conquest. And it is my belief that circumscription helps in forming a religious cult that then has a priesthood that starts off with voluntary tithing. These tithes become culturally mandated, and then eventually they become mandatory. Either you have a social norms. Either the people will get shunned so much by not tithing that they basically can't function in the town, or you get to a point where it's like, well, we'll just banish people who don't tithe, right? Either way, I think eventually you get to a point where they just start banishing people who don't tithe, and banishing is close to death at those times. So I don't know for sure how it happens that way, but in every state you see that their claimed justification is religious. Now, that could just be they conquer an area, they subjugate them in that area by force, and then use religion to try to justify it in time. Maybe. I don't think so. And the reason for this is where it was. It was somewhere in modern day Turkey, in the eastern portion of Turkey. And this was a city-state without a military, right? You had just these priests who required people pay these taxes and to build, this priestly monument place. I forget the name of the city. I actually did a thing on it in my little mini-series, 100 Epiphanies. And they didn't require a military to enforce the taxation. But you see a religious, but even if it was military conquest and then religious justification, the ubiquity of religious justification of states makes it seem that the state is, from its inception, it seems appropriate to call the state, originally at least, a religious institution, right? Maybe not today, although some may say it is in a different way, like, religious in terms of religious thinking, okay? But I'm talking, when I say religion, I mean a theistic religion. And so the state originally, and I would say in most incarnations through most of the history of the world, by time, the state, or all states in general, were theistically, religiously justified. Okay, then you go to the origins of the university. And I don't know if I made a video on this, but I've in this book that I keep doing and keep not doing, I talk about this as well, is the origin of the university, which is basically religious. That's not even something that's debatable. I mean, they started off as the cathedral schools that were to teach the priesthood. You had to teach them how to read Latin, you had to teach them to do astronomy, and teach them some basic geometry and some basic math so they could manage a parish's finances and land deals and stuff. So, not particularly rigorous stuff, but, I mean, if you're an illiterate peasant, like, step one is learning how to read, and so that's kind of a difficult thing to do. So, by today's standards, it probably wouldn't seem very difficult. It'd be a bit of it would seem odd to call this college, but, that's what it was. It was just a trade school for the priesthood. Of course, they were taught theology as well. So, a trade school for the priesthood, and eventually you had these cathedral schools. At first, there would just be like areas in an area near the church in a town, and sometimes the professors, right? I always thought the term professor sounded rather religious, like confessor. But yeah, professor, I always thought it had a Christian origin. Professor sounds Christian-y, and of course, it does have a Christian origin. This is not a deniable thing or debatable thing. And people would go to these towns, and they would sign up for courses. And the courses, sometimes they would be held in the cathedral itself. Sometimes it would be held outside in like a field somewhere. Or sometimes it would be held in like a pub, or like they'd rent a pub or rent a room somewhere to have it, It wasn't until later that these cathedral schools started to have set buildings and a set campus. And the idea of a campus came later. Originally it was just, you learn here and there about, what you need to learn. Part of the thing that you got was a textbook. This was before the printing press. And you got your textbook by having a book with nothing written on it, and you would write. You would copy the professor's textbook. That was and even if you did not become a priest, you would leave your education with this book, this textbook, right? Which was a very, very valuable thing. So at the very least, you got that, right? Which you may be able to sell for a pretty penny at the time, because books were very hard to come by. And of course, that's where the idea of the textbook comes from, and that mode of education, of actually going to the cathedral schools, going to a location around a cathedral, even if it's not a campus, going there to the professors. That method is a pre-book method. It's a method that predates the printing press. And in my opinion, now some will say no, but in my opinion, it was made obsolete with the printing press, but continued because of inertia and status thinking, right? If you just read a textbook on how to become a clergyman and then pass some standardized tests on how to become a clergyman, well, that's nice and all, but you didn't go to Harvard, right? You didn't go to MIT. You didn't go to the cathedral to get the officialdom, right? And I think that's the kind of thinking that led to a perpetuation of the system, when you could have had a much more efficient system where, following the printing press, you just get a book and then you take an exam. Right? you learn it or you don't. That seems much more efficient, much cheaper, and a lot more people can do it. You can have a guy who's working all day, and he doesn't have to travel to a cathedral school. He can just get a book, and while he's plowing the fields and working on the barley crop, instead of drinking with his buddies at night, the 4 hours a day he has to not work, maybe less than that. But I mean, in the winter months, he has some time, and these peasants, they have time, and they have time to study, and if they have the book, well, that's when you can study. It seems a much more efficient way to do it. But of course, that's not how it was done. Even with the printing press, that didn't make books free, and peasants were still quite poor, so I don't know for sure, but my speculation is that this model was a pre-book. But of course, nowadays, when you have the internet, when you had things like newspapers, by that point, the cost of printing something was so cheap that it's a bit inexcusable to continue to have the university system. But then, on the other hand, over time, the university system got more and more complex, and the subject matter got more and more complex. You had the addition of not only how to become a theologian, but also how to become a lawyer, a medicus, or a philosopher. Philosophy then eventually branched off into physics, chemistry, biology, and of course, what is now still called philosophy. Right? What is called philosophy are the subjects that can't really be tackled by the hard sciences. But once they start to become tackled by the hard sciences, then the domain of what is called philosophy shrinks. But at the very beginning, it was just called philosophy. It wasn't. It's kind of weird to think that way. With chemistry, biology, and physics and morality, we're all part of the same subject, philosophy. And that's, of course, an important thing to recognize when thinking about categories, right? Your conception of category, and how your conception of categories molds the way you think. If you imagine that, and I go back one example I keep using. I should probably get more examples of this. Is the Japanese conception of color. The Japanese conception of... They didn't have... we have a color for green and blue, and the Japanese today have a color for green and blue. But prior to contact with the Europeans, the Japanese did not have a color for green or blue. They had a name for green and blue. It was called aoi. And what we call green, to them, was just a shade of aoi. And what they called blue was just a shade of aoi. Right? It was part of kind of a spectrum. In my opinion, when I looked at some looking through medieval Japanese art, I see maybe I'm looking for it. Maybe I'm looking for this because they don't differentiate green and blue categorically. I wonder how much that affects their thinking. Just because they have different labels, I wonder how much that affects their substantive thinking. And I recall when looking at medieval or feudal Japanese art, looking at grass, when they painted grass and when they painted oceans, I noticed that the grass seems bluish and the oceans seem greenish. But then again, oceans filled with bacteria and plankton and oceanic detritus can look green at times. So maybe that is how the oceans look, when the artist is actually painting it. And of course, I've heard of the blue grass, green grass that we would still call green, but it's kind of bluish tinted. So does that really affect it? I don't know. But anyway, that was a bit of a tangent talking about philosophy and categories and the subject of philosophy. So we have the religious origins of the state, I contend. I think that circumscription helps, that if you have a circumscribed area, like a river valley or a mountain valley, that aids in the formation of these cults, because you then have... It's difficult to leave... a circumscribed area, yes, that does make it easier to conquer militarily, because you can't really escape, and it's much easier to control people because they're right there. Whereas a hunter-gatherer tribe, they can just wander off a mile the other direction. It's hard to keep control of those kinds of people, whereas when they're in a river valley, it's easier to threaten them with force. They're not going anywhere because they're farmers at that location, and there you go. But I would also say that it's easier to get people to conform to a religious tithe by purely social means. That doesn't require any force, because they're there. They have to, make good with all the neighbors around them. They can't just wander into the woods another 10 miles or whatever. So yes, being circumscribed makes it easier to extort people with force, but it also makes it easier to morally browbeat people as well, right? And so people point to states forming in circumscribed areas as evidence in favor of military force being the origin of states. But a religious theory can also explain that, is what I'm saying. I'm saying that both theories explain that. So that's what I would say on that. Okay, but if you point to the religious origin of the university and the religious origin of the state, or if you don't believe that, if you still believe in Carniero's circumscription theory, you know, you still have to say the religiously related theory of state formation, or its highly religious nature at the beginning, right? Even if it didn't form of religion, its highly religious nature at the beginning. I mean, you have to say. So both of these things. And certainly states, once they got going, you know, however murky their origins are, certainly once they got going, they were very religious in their justifications and in their decision making, in their decisions to invade and decisions to build monuments. And, you know, this is real belief. Like, these pharaohs building these giant triangles of sand in the middle of the desert, you know, phenomenally stupid, phenomenally wasteful stuff. I mean, that's true belief right there. And that, I would think, as an advocate, if I were A, an advocate of big government, who B, went to the university and was very fond of universities, the inherently religious origin of both of these institutions would trouble me. It would trouble me a lot. So, religious thinking. Now, obviously, universities today are not religious, right? And of course, today there are universities founded that are not founded with any religious motivation. You know, you look at Harvard and Yale, for example, two big examples. They were Harvard, for example, was founded in order to have an educated clergy in the New World, because the clergy that came in that area were educated at Cambridge. But there was no Cambridge in the New World, so they set up Harvard. So Harvard was going to be, you know, the Cambridge of the New World. And of course today Harvard is bigger and badder than Cambridge. And then of course Harvard then evolved, and now Harvard's theology department today is kind of a running joke. You know, its original mission is kind of, you know. So if the university is prone to religious effects, or prone to religious thinking, or amplifies it, or something like that, well, what would we expect to see nowadays? And like, what is religious thinking? Well, in order to pin down what religious thinking actually is, I think we should look at religions. And I don't think you need to do a particularly deep looking at of religions, just kind of a broad panoply of religions. Generally what you see a god, a deity. These deities normally are not omnipotent. Okay, you accept the existence of other deities. You don't believe that your deity is the one and only. I'm talking about the city-state religions, for example, around Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece. Now, the funny thing is that if, like, we talk about the Greek pantheon, the Egyptian pantheon, and the Mesopotamian pantheon, but this was not like an Egyptian religion with this pantheon, and these are the gods. If the Egyptians come into contact with the Greek city-states, and the Greek city-state says, yes, this is the patron deity of Athens, whatever, Athena, or I don't know or care who was the patron deity of Athens. The Egyptians wouldn't say, no, only the Egyptian pantheon exists. No, they'd say, oh, then they would treat it as just another city-state with its god like theirs do. Same if they came into contact with the Mesopotamians. So we say, yeah, there's the Egyptian pantheon, Mesopotamian pantheon, and Greek pantheon, but that's merely a function of their geographic separation. That's not a function of them. They're not separate religions in the way that Islam and Christianity are separate religions. They would all accept each other if they all came into contact with each other on a more regular basis. And as far as I know, did accept each other and did accept the existence of all those gods. So you see that, okay. But what you also see in the city-states, you also see tribal-specific religions. You know, you have the god of the tribe. And the most obvious example, the most interesting example is, of course, the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh. That's originally all it was. The Hebrews were just one group of people, okay, with a God that looked out for their people. That God was Yahweh. That's it. Yahweh was not the creator of all life, was not the beginning of the end and the end of all creation. Okay, nothing grandiose like that. He was just the God of their people. And there's maybe some dumb story about how their people came to be, and Yahweh had something to do with, who cares? But it wasn't this grandiose one and only God, do not put any other gods before me kind of bullshit. That came later. So Christianity came out of one of these, what I would call an ethno-religion. Ethno-religion. Now, I'm going to be talking about that a lot more because I believe that all religion is inherently ethnic. Whether you want it or not, all religion is inherently ethnic. And all religion is inherently an ethno-religion. You look at, for example, the Native Americans. The Native American religions, and they always talk about their ancestors. Same with, the Norsal peoples, and there's all this, same Egypt and Anatolia. Don't know as much about Mesopotamia, but they always talk about their ancestors, and they bury their ancestors in nice tombs. And ancestral worship is common throughout the world, right? Ancestors, your lineage, your tribe, your people, right? Your people going past through the ages, they're looking out for you. And when you look at racial nationalists, they often refer to their ancestry. Oswald Mosley, I was thinking about. And of course, Oswald Mosley in this scene, he's wearing a black collared shirt, right? Has that old timey microphone suspended by like a metal rod from both ends. Looks really cool, and he's standing in front of everyone, and it's just totally punk rock that scene there. He's going on about through the ages, the ghosts of England's past. Well, I don't know where that speech is, but it's very interesting. And now, or I forget what he said, but it looked really cool. And he was referring, of course, to the ancestors. And national movements always refer to their ancestors of all races: Native Americans, white European, all the Vikings, the African racial movements. And of course, the problem with African racial movements is that they have the fists coming up, and they disguise themselves as kind of Marxists, ideological, fighting the oppressor sort of thing. But I contend that doesn't really exist and can't really exist based on how humans work. But those movements, they combine, a lot of talk about fighting the oppressor with black identity, and you see, the spears of and the African shield, and they're doing the tribal dances to connect with the past, and they have little images of their ancestors, right? I wouldn't go as far as call that ancestor worship, but of course in Nazi propaganda, or in communist propaganda, Soviet propaganda, or propaganda in Maoist China, they'd show little images of communists, of Chinese. Hundreds of years ago, right, superimposed on Chinese today, right, and the same thing, and the Soviets would do that as well. They'd show like a Russian, soldier from, the 1500s superimposed, with a sword and shield, superimposed, superimposed on that is a modern Russian soldier with a rifle and a bayonet and a helmet, right, and the Germans did the same thing, right. So what I see there is an ethno-religion, right? Being in a secular form in both the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany. Now, I would say in the Soviet Union, the religion aspect was more important relative to Nazi Germany, where the ethno aspect was more important. Or I don't know about more important or not. People are generally the same. Those people are generally the same. The Germans and Russians biologically, and so their cognitive predispositions are probably the same on both sides there. But I would say that the Nazi regime probably put more emphasis on the ethno side and less on the religious side. But But to what extent that's even meaningful, I'm not sure. You look at the Christian religion, Right. Even today, Christianity ostensibly is this universalist idea. It is for the, all are equal in the eye of God, and all will be judged equally before, before St. Peter's gate, whatever. Okay. But at the same time, the Jews are God's chosen people. And even in Christianity, when Jesus died for everyone's sins, even after that, even after all that, and you had the disciples scattered throughout the Mediterranean, and you have Peter forming his little churches in Asia Minor. Even when you had all that happening, you still had that wacko not wacko, but he had a wacko experience and wrote the book of Revelations. Even that, he referred to the tribes of Israel, the seven something, who cares? Some tribes of Israel coming back to that area, forming New Jerusalem. Even then, you still had a bit of that, the Jews as God's chosen people. In Christianity, which is supposed to be universalist, that ethno-religion of Yahweh and the Hebrews continues straight on into modern-day Christianity. Islam, in my opinion, there's all sorts of doctrinaire stuff, and there's the belief, and there's the angel that came in. I mean, what happened was Muhammad was having sleep paralysis and sleep apnea, right? And sleep paralysis, what generally what happens is you're suffocating. You feel like you're suffocating on your chest because you're paralyzed, right? And so you can breathe, but your breathing is automatic, right? It's only the automatic functions that are allowed. Any voluntary movement is paralyzed, but your eyes are open. So basically your eyes are open, but you can't move your body. And so you can see the room around you, but the problem is you're seeing all sorts of crazy things because you're still dreaming. Like you're dreaming, but your eyes are open. And so the external world you can see, but on top of the external world, you're seeing all this dream imagery. And usually it's negative. And I think there's evidence that dreams in general are negative, but if you're in that situation and you're paralyzed, well, you're probably going to be kind of scared, and so the imagery is even more negative. And so Muhammad was in that situation. He was having sleep paralysis, and so he saw a vision of a scary entity. And what was the scary entity doing? Well, the scary entity was choking him, right? Choking. You can look it up. You can look up the monster on the chest, the old hag on the chest, they sit on your chest and they start choking you. Some sort of monstrous entity comes in, sits on your chest, and starts choking you. That's sleep paralysis, and that is a very common dream that occurs when someone is having sleep paralysis. Right? I personally have had that dream until because I have sleep paralysis all the time. But then I trained myself to, as soon as I have sleep paralysis, to immediately close my eyes and go back down and go back into deeper sleep. I don't try to fight it at all, because if you try to fight it, you'll just get, the fear will rise, and you'll start seeing all sorts of scary things. And even though you know that it's not real, it's still scary. And moreover, when you're dreaming, your logical faculties aren't entirely there, so you're not as aware of its unreality as you are when you're awake and present. Anyway, so that's what Muhammad had. It was basically sleep paralysis, and then he had a flying dream where he flew around and stuff. But in my opinion, that was not... that was an ethnic issue regarding the Arabs and the Jews. That the Jews that Muhammad kind of disliked the Jews, and he didn't like the fact, and he didn't like the pro-Jewish influence. He was fond of Christianity. He really hated Judaism, and he really did not like the Jews being God's chosen people at all. And so what he did is he cooked up a religion where the Arabs were God's chosen people, sort of. Not really. Not in the text. Not in the text is it said that that the Arabs are God's chosen people. But, and this is problematic because you see, for example, in the Soviet Union, you have these appeals, when they're in a war with Nazi Germany, you have these appeals to Russian identity. And I don't know if Islam is Arabic identity, but I think that was the original impetus for it. Right? Because when you look at all the other religions, they're all ethnicity-based. It's all ethno-religion. Okay? And I'm going to do some evo-psych speculating here. in order to think of your people and to think of the well-being of your people and your tribe through the ages, you have to have abstract thought. You have to think of, well, your grandfather and his grandfather before that, going through the ages, to have an idea of that. And in order to think abstractly, in order to think and plan in ways that would help your offspring, right? As opposed to, just fucking whatever and getting enough food to make it to the next day, right? That kind of thinking. But this sort of long-term thinking, this abstract thinking. And why are you having this abstract thinking? What motivates you? Well, your offspring, okay? And that is a very powerful motivator, that offspring attachment. Another powerful motivator is your kin group attachment. Okay, so there you have one, the family bond. Two, the racial bond, or the tribal bond, the ethnic bond. I think the racial bond in reality today is the most meaningful and important, and what white people should be doing, should be looking at, but it's the same function. And in recognizing this, in recognizing the well-being of the tribe, I think this creates a sort of tribal religion. In China, you had a national religion, and in the Soviet Union, Russia in particular, you had a national religion, a religion of the nationality, the Russian nationality. And it is this fusion of religion and ethnic identity. I think it's almost inappropriate to call it a fusion. I think it's inappropriate to even call it, to differentiate the two, because I believe that religion is inherently ethnic in nature. One thing I've also noticed, and I haven't done a systematic study of this, is that when Nelson Mandela was trafficking explosives and the ANC bombed some buses full of white kids in South Africa, I looked at the image and said white Christian kids. You look at Republicans talking about their, who does Hollywood hate? Oh, it hates white Christians. You look at the Nazi propaganda. They talk about Jews attacking the white Christian society of traditional Germany at that time. White Christian America. It's not just Christian; it's white Christian. Moreover, you look at black churches. These aren't. Why do you have those things? Why do you have historically black churches? Right? Why do you have them today? Why do you have Hispanic churches? Isn't it one religion for all people? Well, yeah. I mean, technically, that's what Christianity is supposed to be. And you have these African immigrants and Caribbean immigrants going to the United Kingdom. They don't do the worship services with the Europeans. I can't blame them because those services are incredibly droll. But it appears to me that there is a black church by and for blacks that is to a degree its own religion. And in the more extreme cases, the crazier cases, you have them saying that Jesus was black, right? And I think that's a very clear example, a clear confirmation of my belief that it's not religion, it's ethno-religion, right? And that's what they were from the outset, is that from the very outset, I think we look at Christianity, having lived under Christianity and our nearest neighbor Islam for so long, both of these religions claim to be non-ethnic. They all claim to be universal religions, okay? But even within Christianity, especially in the United States, you see the black churches, the quote-unquote Hispanic churches, the mestizo churches, and they have their own little Catholic thing going on. And then you have, mainline white Christian Protestant churches. And then you have Mormons who are all white. Okay? What's his face? What was his name? Brigham Young. In the Book of Mormon, he refers to blacks as having gotten their black skin because they did something wrong. So I think that's the natural order of things, is not, just not this abstract, pure ideological thing, but is actually ethno-religion. That's the natural order of things. So when we get back to Christianity today, what is Christianity today? Well, in one sense, you have Christianity as a Jewish ethno-religion, right? The Jews are the chosen people, and so you have conservatives in the U.S. being big fans of Israel, wanting to fund Israel to the hilt. But also white Christianity as well. You have that white Christian thing, right? And it's tied together because it's not just a religion, it's an ethno-religion. Same thing with the black Christianity. It's not Christianity, it's also the black struggle, okay? And you look at the story of the Jews, which is largely, not entirely a crock, but to a degree a crock. it's a crock at the very beginning, at least. Now, as we get into the pogroms and the Holocaust, then you probably get a lot more truth. In fact, I believe you do, and in fact, I think that the high IQs of the Jews is evidence of that truth, and that they were pushed into money lending industries or into money lending, and so if they weren't good at money lending, they died, and that's why the Jews who remain have such high IQs. Anyway. But early on, you have this persecution story, right? We were enslaved by the Egyptians. False, they were mercenaries. We tried to escape, and the Egyptians wouldn't let them. False, the Egyptians were fine with them letting them. What happened was the Hebrews started their migration to Canaan, and on their way, they started sacking Egyptian towns, taking their grain, and killing some animals, and getting provisions for themselves, and in response, the Pharaoh sent in an army. They didn't go across the Red Sea. They went through some marshes in the Nile Delta. Moses had been that way before, so he knew exactly where to go through, whereas the Egyptians did not know how to go through, and so they got stuck in the marshes, and the Hebrews got through, and so that's how they were able to evade the Egyptians. And of course, then they got into Canaan, and they killed them. Right? They killed a bunch of people and took their land. But of course, there was a story that we're persecuted, and that's we're persecuted, but with God's help, we will overcome. Right? That's the Jewish story, and that's why I look at Martin King. He paints the experience of Africans in the United States in largely the same colors. Now, the reality is that the blacks themselves sold themselves into slavery. Right? There are blacks who sold other blacks into slavery. So it wasn't a bunch of white people going in and enslaving them. Moreover, it wasn't Europeans stimulating the slave. First off, Europeans stimulating the slave trade. Okay, that wouldn't absolve anyway. But moreover, the slave trade within Africa was always larger. There were in the year 1800, there are approximately 15 million African slaves in the Americas. There are about 30 million on the continent of Africa. And this was, of course, at the height of the American slave trade. Right? Remember, the slave trade within Africa had been going on since at least 1000 AD, arguably long before that. Okay, so anyway. So to a degree, it's kind of a crock, the idea of blacks being oppressed. Now, they were in fact enslaved. Lucky for them, they went to the Americas. Yeah, they had to go across on slave ships. But the survival rate for black on a slave ship was about the same as that of a sailor in the Royal Navy doing over the course of their entire career. Now, it's true the career of someone in the Royal Navy was longer than a single passage on a slave ship, but that should put that in a little bit of perspective. Moreover, the whites who worked on the slave ships died about as much as any single African died. Now, to be fair, the whites who worked on the slave ships, they did more voyages than the blacks did, right? I mean, I'll put it this way. A white person on the ship has just as much a chance of surviving his entire career as working on a slave ship as an African has of surviving a single voyage on a slave ship. Right? So, the white person does have a higher chance for any particular voyage, but it's not, right? I mean, that should just put that into perspective. And I think what a lot of people, when looking at the kind of living conditions that the African slaves faced, I think a lot of them forget what life was at that point in history. Right. So anyway, they were enslaved, right? Unlike the Hebrews of Israel, they actually were chattel slaves. So there's that. And then you have Martin King coming along. And Martin King, I think that's why... I think the reason why Martin King became so popular is because he just got lucky with the media. That's who the journalists followed. He did some marches or whatever, and then the journalists started following him, right? And the journalists started following him, and so more blacks started following him, and right? And so it just kind of built up that way. But, there's nothing special about Martin King. Black preachers are a dime a dozen. So if it wasn't him, some other black preacher would have done that, and then the cameras and the journalists all would have centered on that guy. And what he did, why it was so powerful, is he basically created a new ethno-religion. Or not really created it. It had sort of already existed. Black churches had already existed. He had created a ethno-religion for African Americans, which is we are oppressed, we are struggling, we will overcome, right? God willing, right? So there's kind of a story for their people, right? The Africans. And their people has a God, the Christian God. Now, it's not as explicit as the old religions, because, for example, you have, Isis, the god of Babylon. I don't know if that was the god of Babylon, but yeah, you had like the god of Babylon, and you had the people of Babylon, which were like a large extended tribe. Say, okay, so that's and that was explicit. Whereas this, the God that the black churches worship and believe is looking out for them is ostensibly the same God that that the white churches worship, right? Ostensibly, technically, that's what the text says. That's what they consciously, formally believe. But I don't think that's what they feel, right? And I'm talking about feels here. I'm talking about a difference between what is technically doctrinally stated and what is consciously believed versus what is really going on. And when I say really going on, I mean at a feel level, what they feel is going on. And I think what they feel is they're feeling their ethno-religion, right? Anyway, I want to take this further. There was some French dude some French philosopher guy who was referring to, not pejoratively but positively. He was saying that the ideas of the French Revolution was the religion of the human. And so you have these people you have this rise of atheism. And concurrent with the rise of atheism is a rise in secular ideology. Prior to atheism, and it doesn't even need to be atheism, just a weakening of religion will do this, is you'll have secular ideologies, belief in democracy, belief in all sorts of rights, belief in redistributions. And as it progresses, you end up having anarchism / Marxism, and I'll get into Nazism in a little bit. That's kind of a special case. But what I think, and this is getting into really complicated and seems esoteric. I don't think it's esoteric at all. Is that what is called modern day quote unquote liberalism today is an ethno-religion. In the same vein as mainline Protestantism and the black churches is. Their religion comes from the universities, mainly. Now, ostensibly, like with Christianity, their views, they're not going to call it a religion, but I mean, fine, we'll call it ideology. Their ideology is ostensibly universal. Right? It's ostensibly universal in nature. It ostensibly applies to everyone, okay? Islam is ostensibly universal, ostensibly applies to everyone. The people where Islam originated was the Arab world. But it's not technically an artifact of Arab nationalism, but practically I think it kind of is. I think any Arab nationalist is going to be a Muslim. I think it's very odd to have someone who's a fervent Arab nationalist who is a Christian. I think that'd be a very strange thing. Okay. Now, I'll call them the universitarians. There's another thing where they go by is social justice crowd, the Tumblr social justice crowd. Okay. You could also they like to call themselves liberals. I don't think they're very liberal. Like, what are they liberal about aside from baubles like drugs and having sex all around and having your sluttiness accepted and fat accepted? Like aside from like these stupid things, like what are you liberal about? Nothing. They're not liberal about anything really. But if they're an ethno-religion, with Islam, I'm just going to say it. I think Islam is an Arabic ethno-religion. I know the majority of Muslims around the world today are not Arabic anymore. I know. Okay. But, okay, so what is the ethno of the liberals? Well, among the in Islam, you have the Arab is the pro-ethnic and the Jews are the anti-ethnic, right? That's their enemy. Okay. Who's the ethnic of the white liberals? Well, I think going off what Jonathan Haidt said, in one of his presentations, he speaks of blacks being sacralized. Blacks, gays, women, oddly enough, women as an ethnic group. But I don't think that really is that big. I think feminism is kind of a minor sort of thing. I think the real ethno of this group is blacks, right? Kind of like how among white Christian conservatives, they love Jews via the state of Israel, right? They're very pro-state of Israel, right? Part of their ethno-religion is Jews are God's chosen people, but implicit in that is also, white Christian America, right? This idea of white Christian America. And I think in the ethno-religion of the Universitarians, that's what quote-unquote progressivism kind of is. But it's weird because unlike other religions, unlike Marxism, it doesn't have a set doctrine. Like Marxism had its set doctrine. Nazism didn't have so much. I mean, it had Mein Kampf, but well, what is that? And it had the writings of Alfred Rosenberg, but what are those? So I mean, Nazism didn't really have much of a set doctrine, really, whereas Marxism did. And supposedly the Soviet Union was founded on that, but that's another debate for another time. Mao had his little red book, which everyone had, but I don't know how many actually read, and that was the state religion there. But with what is called modern-day liberalism or progressivism, these are rather self-congratulatory titles, they don't have that, which makes you think, oh, well, then they're not a religion. Well, that seems unlikely, because you can say, well, the Soviet Union, that's like a religion. That's a secular religion. Communism is a secular religion. Maoism was a secular religion. Maoism, kind of a bastard offshoot of Marxism, is a secular religion. Nazism, is Nazism a secular religion? I would say so as well. It's a bit of an odd duck, but I would say so as well. I mean, it's certainly ethno. It certainly has all of the pomp and circumstance that religions tend to have. Okay, it has grandiose speeches. It goes back to the ancestors like the old ethno-religions did. Okay, the fact that the SS spoke of trying to get rid of Christianity and its Jewish influence and and replace it with paganism. In fact, anyway, you can read up on that if you want. And so I think Nazism was anti-Christian, but pro-German identity. Well, not necessarily German identity, but Aryan identity. The idea of a mythical Aryan race, either from somewhere in Central Asia or this now gone island of Hyperborea, right, where the Aryans lived. And the Aryans, of course, then spread throughout the world, and now that island is gone, right? And so that's the idea of Hyperborea. And traces of Aryan ancestry can be seen in different peoples. Most concentrated among the people in Norway and Sweden and Denmark, and to a lesser extent in Britain and Germany, right? And that's basically where the Nordic or Aryan types are. And they're not even Nordic necessarily. They're Hyperborean. They just happen to spread throughout the world, and their most concentrated remains are in Scandinavia, Britain, and Germany. Anyway, that's not what this is about. This is about what is called progressivism or liberalism. I think it should be called Universitarianism, because I think it's the religion of the universities. Now, they don't have a set doctrine, that's true, but I don't think liberals really disagree much on issues. That's a broad, very general claim that's going to require proof, which I don't have on hand. But I know that quote-unquote liberals don't disagree as much as they think they do. I know that. There's been a study on that showing that liberals tend to think they're much more unique in their thought processes than they actually are, whereas conservatives tend to actually think that they're much more common than they actually are. They tend to underestimate their novelty. Now, I would say, this is where you get into the hash, because I would say, well, you can point to the rise of the atheist churches, and I would say that, and I could say that that's evidence that what is called liberalism and progressivism, that's just, that they're that way as well, that they're just another, that they're a secular religion. But, how common are these atheist churches really? Right? All you can really say about these atheist churches is that for those people, this is true. Among those people, it's definitely, their liberalism / progressivism is just a secular religion for them. We can say that. I think I can safely say that. But before even arguing for what I'm trying to say, let me try to fill it out. What exactly is their ethno? What exactly is the ethno religion of? Well, we know that among the quote unquote conservatives, there's two things going on. There's the pro-Jew thing, which comes from the Bible, and then there's the implicit, white Christian. Okay, and pro-Jew, that's explicit because that's biblical doctrine, or perceived biblical doctrine. And then there's white Christian, which is implicit. Now, I would say that you have the same thing going on with the, white liberals, in that they are pro-black, right? Blacks functioning the same kind of, filling the same mental space as the Jews do for the conservatives, and that's explicit. They have all sorts of overdone, over-dramatized, civil rights drama, constantly dredging out slavery, right? Without any historical context as to how, white conscripts were treated, or how white peasants were treated. It's amazing. We hear more about the suffering of Africans under slavery than we do about whites under feudalism in Europe. And of course, the reason for that is because, blacks, they're Americans like us. No, they're Africans like Africans. Okay, the white people in Europe are white like me, right? Not these darkies. Right? They're a Frenchman is closer to me than an Afro-American. Okay, a Frenchman is more my kin, and by Frenchman I mean biologically French, not a black guy who lives in France and speaks French and is recognized as a citizen of the state of France. Right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an actual biological ancestral French person. Okay. Anyway, so we have pro-Jew is the explicit identity of the ethno-religion, and then we have the white Christian is the implicit identity of the conservative ethno-religion, right? And I would say that another piece of evidence for this is that when you look at conservatives who become atheists, they're not all anti-Christian, right? Because just because they're atheists, they're atheists, but in a very trivial sense. Because they're atheists, but that's just them not believing in God. They just don't believe in the magical Sky Daddy and pink and purple unicorns in Dimension X, right? That's all it means, And of course, there's obviously not a God, so that's all it means. Okay, it's a very, it's atheism, but all it means is that they don't believe what the Bible literally says. That's all it means. They're not anti-Christian values. They're not anti-Christian civ. In fact, they're very pro all of that, and they're pro the white Christian identity that they identify with. And in many of these technical atheists, I'll call them, they still go to church because they still identify with those people and those values. They still hold to the ethno-religion. They just don't believe in Santa Claus anymore. Okay, whereas when a quote-unquote liberal stops believing in God, they then become hardcore anti-Christian, right? Which makes sense if their enemy ethnicity is white Christian America, right? If they really hate white Christian America, right, then they're going to be anti that, right? And so I think that's, so their ethno-religion is explicitly pro-black, which is I would call it the civil rights narrative, the slavery Jim Crow civil rights narrative, which they're trying to continue with this white privilege stuff, but I think they're having some difficulty with that because superficially, segregation seemed really bad. Now I'd actually argue that segregation was bad, but not as bad as it's portrayed, and there's a few things that could have been done that could have made it good. I wouldn't say what actually was good. What was actually implemented was bad, but it could have been good if they had done it. Well, if they had a more complete segregation, quite frankly. If they just said, all right, we're going to carve out an area, and this is going to be the black country, run by blacks, for blacks, right, all that stuff, and there you go. That's what it's going to be. And you could say, well, that's not fair because they weren't educated. Look, sub-Saharan Africa, right? These slaves are certainly just as, if not more, intellectually capable as the sub-Saharan African countries that they came from. If they had not been enslaved, so that's just the way I see it. But of course, you have this belief that all groups of people are entitled to the standard of living that any other group of people are entitled to. That, for example, that Africans in the U.S. are entitled to the same standard of living that whites in the U.S. have, right? Which is, but problem, right? The progressive doesn't see the Africans as another group, except they actually do. Anyway, so they have this explicit pro-black ethno-religion, but who are they, right? Is it the Mencius Moldbug called them the Brahmins, right? That the Brahmins and townies or whatever, right? And it's a very, and you certainly see it. You certainly see it in this hatred of white Christian America, right? I mean, they really do hate white Christian America a lot, right? And that's certainly an outgroup to them. So what are they? I guess you could call them the secular progressive whites. That's their ethnic group, and it's clearly a distinct ethnic group from white Christian America. But they get converts. I suspect that that's not part of the ethno-religion, that's actually just, their narcissism. Because, and the reason I say that is because of the ease of conversion to the white progressive type. The ease at which a white Christian American can become a white progressive. So in order to convert to Judaism, you have to, it's very difficult to convert to Judaism, for reals. To convert to become part of white Christian America is also a very difficult thing. It's very easy to convert to Christianity, and that's no problem. But to be accepted by white Christian America when you're black, that's a bit more difficult because you're not part of that ethnicity, quite frankly. And technically, well, I'm Christian, aren't I? I'm a brother in Christ. Yeah, and of course, technically, ostensibly, doctrinarily, white Christian America is not racially exclusive, but practically speaking, it kind of is, right? Because it's an ethnic group, it's an ethno-religion. It's just as exclusive as a black church. Not just as exclusive, but it's exclusive in the same way that a black church is exclusive. Not technically. I mean, if you're white and you go into a black church, they'll let you in, but they won't let you into their hearts. Okay. And so you see, for example, in white Christian America, a certain exclusivity. Among the Jews, exclusivity. Among black churches and black identity movements, exclusivity. But you don't see exclusivity among the white liberals, which tells me that the Universitarians is not a pro-white ethno religion, in that it's not pro-liberal white ethno-religion. Because you have like the liberal whites and the white Christian America, the conservative whites. But I don't think Universitarianism is pro-liberal white. I think it's pro-black and pro, quote unquote, the oppressed. Right? Black first and foremost because of civil rights, which is its own industry at this point. And pro the oppressed, right? Which is, immigrants and fags and LGBT, BBQ, WTF, and pot smokers and whatever, the oppressed. Now, what you have in ethno-religions is you have the ethno, but you also have the religion. And in these religions, you have various ideas that are held as sacred to the group. When you have a tribe, the tribe has weird kooky beliefs. They believe, for example, doing a little dance causes the rain to come, or rubbing your butt on a stick makes the stick, purifies the stick or something. Who knows, right? You have all these dumb beliefs that you believe because the group believes, right? Would you say communism is a dumb belief? And so that's pretty obvious where I'm going here. We look at, say, these progressive types, and also among the white Christian America types, although on the internet you have less contact with those people. And you deal with these types, and what you see among them is that they take the liberal position and they rationalize it on every single issue. I need to get out of the habit of saying liberal. Universitarian, they take the universitarian position on any issue and they constantly rationalize it. Like, that's the issue. And moreover, what they do is they do what I call conformist snark. Family Guy, Daily Show, Colbert Report, internet memes, are examples of conformist snark, which is you don't hold Mike Shermer, this is what Mike Shermer does. Like if you say, hey, I think that the amount of people killed at Majdanek was less than what is said. And then Mickey Shermer's response is, oh yeah, that's what you say. Well, I actually have a book, Why Do People Believe Dumb Things, where I go into UFOs, Holocaust denial, and urine therapy. Right? You see you see what he did there? Like he just, it's this association tactic. Like you go out, you debate a bunch of creationists. It's like, yeah, I'm going to debate creationists and racists. Yeah, racists and creationists say, it's pretty obvious. I think everyone knows when people do that. It's pretty obvious what they're doing, but they take something that's obviously wrong because of its bias, and say it in the same breath as something that is not obviously wrong because of its bias, and they'll say, yeah, it is obviously wrong because of its bias. It's a racist bias, right? But of course, compared to what? Compared to your, you have these people who spend years in these public schools, learning slavery and civil rights and equality and all this, and it's not. I can't say it's bullshit because they don't even argue for it, right? They just assert it: equal moral worth, equal value, equal Well, gee, it sure doesn't seem that way in terms of how people actually behave, right? But that's what they say, and so they're propagandized this way, and then they go, oh, but the people who are biased, they're the people who don't believe this propaganda, and so we're gonna make some, but it's not propaganda, it's education. Sorry, excuse me. So we're gonna make some cartoons about how dumb they are and how silly they are. We're gonna make some memes about them and post them on the internet. Colbert is gonna impersonate them. Jon Stewart is gonna go like, what? After he minds some particularly dumb quote, probably taken out of context as well, right? And yeah, that's what you do. You got the conformist snark. There you go. You got it all packaged, right? And this conformist snark, this is the tribe. The tribe has X beliefs. You disown the beliefs. Well, it's evolutionarily advantageous to blackball the people who don't believe that the magic stick brings forth rain. Right? Evolutionarily, it makes sense to shun those people who the non-believers. Right? This kind of evolutionary loyalty to the tribal beliefs is seen in political views. Right? Loyalty to the dumb political beliefs, the myth of the founding, the myth of Martin King, the myth of Nelson Mandela. Of course, the reason Mandela was imprisoned was because he was trafficking explosives to blow up some buses, which the ANC actually did, right? Blow up some buses. I don't know if Nelson Mandela was not actually found to have blown up some buses, but he was trafficking explosives, which the ANC then used to blow up some buses full of, some white South Africans, white Christian South Africans, I might add. So yeah, and so I think that it's possible that you could say, well, the liberal progressive people that I'm just going to call them universitarian people, are not an ethno-religion, but I think they are at this point. They're an ethno-religion, and like all ethno-religions, it has some they have quirky beliefs that are not even necessarily part and parcel of advancing the well-being of that ethnicity, although it can be. Like blacks supporting big welfare states is in their perceived self-interest, takes resources from whites and gives it to them. Whether or not that's actually good for them, that's another question, but that's their perceived self-interest. But, let's say you have a country that's like all blacks at a point, and they're all Marxists, and they connect Marxism with their black identity. But there's no whites who are expropriating. There's no whites land to take at this point. So the Marxism doesn't have the ethnic conflict purpose. So what purpose does it hold? Well, at that point, it's just one of the weird, quirky beliefs of the ethnicity. Right? And so when people say, and that's what I think, when David Duke comes on and says we need to preserve our culture, when he really means race. Or when you have all these conservatives say, American cultural values, What they're talking about is they're talking about the beliefs of the ethno-religion of white Christian America. That's what they're talking about, right? They call that American values. There's no such thing as American values. What they're referring to is white Christian people in the United States, the views and the values that those people hold, right? The weird, quirky beliefs, right? The magic rain stick of their specific ethno-religion. And they're loyal to those beliefs because those are the beliefs of their ethno-religion, okay? And when you look, and I think that the fucking universitarians are the exact same way. They don't think so because they're just so fucking enlightened. They went to college and their beliefs actually come from the academies. And how can the academies be dumb? Like I went to the cathedral school and I learned Latin. You know? But I think the whole well, another problem with college is that more and more people are going to them, and so they're no longer like this elite institution anymore like they used to be. And I think that thanks largely to like privilege people, like people who talk about this, that, and the other privilege, I think that's also harming their credibility. The problem is like this is not a conspiracy. Like there's no central, like if there was some central committee organizing, you know, what I call universitarianism, they wouldn't do this privilege crap. They that's going a bit too far, and it's costing them certain credibility. No longer is like having a degree in anything but a hard science. I think there's also a problem. I think there's a problem in that. I don't want to underestimate it, but because like somebody can, for example, you know, this girl on YouTube had a degree in something biology, and so the problem is people then thought that she knew what heritability meant. She actually didn't know what heritability meant. And I tried to explain to her that heritability can change. If the environmentality of something increases, that the heritability can decrease. And she said, no, it doesn't. You're full of shit. And then she made another video saying, oh, yeah, you're actually right. But the problem is, like the viewers don't know that, like, okay, geneticists don't necessarily deal in top-down heritability estimates. Like, they don't, you know. Sometimes they're not, sometimes they don't even learn hardly any of that, or they have, like, one unit on it, because that's not what they do, okay? When you're doing, you know, or you're, you know, you're doing, for example, you're working with plants, or you're working with Mendelian traits in animals, okay? You're not dealing with polygenic traits, period, you know, then you're not going to be doing these general heritability estimates. And you're especially not going to be doing top-down heritability estimates. So and that's another problem, is that people that laymen don't know who the real experts are, right? And so and you saw this with Evogen. You saw Evogen just spouting off a bunch of population genetics. My opinion is that he was actually reading from his textbook. That's my opinion. I think he was actually finding passages, because if you actually watch his videos, the reason his videos are so long is because he was going on and on about things not at all relevant to what anyone was actually saying. The problem is the audience had no clue that of the irrelevance of what Evogen was actually saying, right? Evogen would say a bunch of irrelevant crap and say that, and therefore what you said is not true because genes don't work this way. Sometimes there is sometimes a mutation can occur simply because of a chemical attraction. Well, no shit. Like, it's a chemical, but and so that refutes your point somehow. Like, no, it doesn't. Like that, like, and it's such a weird thing. And of course, he would also just straight up lie about what was said in sources. He would say there was, you know, this paper did not find any race differences in the low repeat MAOA gene. They did not find any differences in frequency of the low repeat allele of the MAOA gene. Of course, he just literally lied about the study like that. Like, that was amazing. He bald faced made shit up. Like, not even like, and he got away with it. That was what was absolutely amazing about this. And so that's a problem with expertise. And so the university is still problematic in that way, and that you get these people going around, you know, claiming to be experts. I've done that, you know. I'll do it on the internet. I won't do it in real life, but on the internet I'll say I have a history degree and start saying a bunch of stuff in history, and it has a positive effect, right? Because I know a lot about history. I've read a lot about history. not only have I read a lot about history, but I've read a lot about history that the masses are interested in, because I don't read history according to an academic course, which would probably give you a more balanced series of subjects in which you are exposed to. I'll say that. I wouldn't say a more balanced perspective. You'll probably get a less balanced perspective, but you're more evenly, even in terms of places and times. Whereas my history is like, history specifically regarding early state formation, early religions, the rise of democracy, the relative economic powers of countries during the Revolutionary War, the Holocaust, the industrial policy of Japan, the Soviet Union, Germany, the United States, and Britain. Right? Not kind of an eclectic thing based on what I think matters. So, well, of course, maybe I would change my opinion of what I think matters if I had learned more about other time periods, but that's something to think about. Anyway, I think I'll end this video here. This was just kind of a stream of consciousness thing. Just wanted to get some ideas out there, because I was thinking about this. I think the initial driving idea that led to this massive chain of thought was this idea thinking like how people actually think, like religious people versus non-religious people, like how big of a gap is there, right? And to what extent, like we have all, you look at these political movements, they have rallies, they have their symbols, oftentimes they have sacred texts, they have sacred figures, and I eventually, I don't know how I made the connection, but I eventually made the connection of, political ideologies, for example, communism, being tied to Russian identity, Russian ethnic identity. Okay, communism, right? You fight communism. Oh, we're fighting the commies. Yeah, we're shooting down some Ruskies. Wait, commies or Ruskies? Which one? Well, same thing, right? Ethno-religion, ethno-religion of Soviet communism, right? That's what it was. And it was at that point that I thought, not that I wasn't thinking ethno-religion. I was thinking ethno-political ideology. But then I got back to thinking about Islam and the term Allah, right? Now, Allah is just Arab for God. Okay, and so when Australians say, yeah, I believe in Islam and I worship Allah, no, fuckface, you worship God. Okay, Allah is just a towel head sand nigger for God. All right, that's all it is. It's just the Arabic word for God. If you're reading a Quran that's been translated to English, it shouldn't say Allah. It should say God. Okay, Allah is just the Arab word for God. There's nothing holy about it. Okay, in an Arabic translation of the Bible, it wouldn't say God. It would say Allah, because that's their word for God. All right. Anyway, and so I was thinking about that. And I was thinking about well, to what extent is Islam a Arab nationalism? And then I just did a little thought experiment. Well, let's say you had a hardcore Arab nationalist. Would he be Muslim or well, of course he would be. Either he would be Muslim or he would be secretly, a non-believer, but he would go along with it and say, it's good. It keeps the community together. And of course, what he's doing is he's upholding the ethno-religion. And then I went back, well, what about, white Christian America? And you have the atheists, the technical atheists, as I call them, like how I was for a while. They still, I'm an atheist, but I think the church is a good thing. And, well, because they're still holding on to the ethno-religion. They're definitely holding on to the ethno. And, it's human nature to continue to respect the beliefs of the ethnic group of which you are a part. If they happen to be Christianity, well, then you're going to respect those beliefs. Which is why the atheists of the left tend to be hardcore, right? They tend to be hardcore anti-Christianity. And it's not that they really hate, oh God, how dare these people believe how dare they not believe in evolution? So that's a bit dubious. It's dubious that these people are really that motivated about this group of people not believing in evolution. Does that really infuriate you that much? Is that really what this is about? Is this really about frickin', 6 days, 7 days, micro versus, is this really about that? Do you really care this much about that? And it's funny, you'll see them come up with excuses. Well, I don't like evolution because they're teaching kids about, what a lame It's like a kid who's interested in biology is going to learn evolution, and moreover, I don't want to get into that. I think that even biologists, like to what extent, like if you're a biologist and you don't believe in evolution, how much is that really going to affect your ability to do biology? Right? I know, I'm gonna hear Thunderfoot say it's gonna impact it a lot. Let me ask you this: when you study how DNA works, for example, are you studying the evolution of it? Do you need to know the evolution of it to know how it works? To know the ACTG and the RNA transcriptase poop face? Do you need to know all that? Do you need to know like how that evolves step by step? Here's another interesting thing. I'll answer that with this. There's still debates as to how that evolved, right? So it's not clear how that evolved, and yet people are still able to work with it, even though it's not clear how it evolved, right? We're still able to do genetic modification of crops, for example, even though it's not clear how DNA evolved, right? There's speculative models, with the primordial soup with the little volcanic water thing and the little, the bubbles forming around the certain, ancestral RNA, which then creates things that pop out and form a cell wall, right? There's all that hypothesizing, but that's all it is, all hypothesizing. They don't really know. They don't really have a firm grasp of how RNA and DNA evolved. But that doesn't matter, right? You don't have to know how it evolved in order to work with it, all right? And that's one thing. That's one thing. But just based on that, I think it's pretty clear that you don't need to believe in evolution to be able to do biology. I don't. So, and moreover, the kinds of kids who are, this gets into their bogus thinking that everyone can be an astronaut. See, because like I'm gonna say, the kinds of kids who are going to do biology, they're not gonna fall for creationist BS. And even if they did, I don't think it would have much of an effect. But the vast majority of kids, like, it doesn't matter if you teach them evolution or not, because they're not going to be biologists. Most of them aren't even smart enough to be biologists, period, okay? Of those who are smart enough to be biologists, most of those are not going to be biologists, either because they don't have the work ethic to do that, or their passion is in something else, okay? So there's that. So you're dealing with the potential pool of biologists is a very small number of people, okay? And of that, let's say they don't believe in evolution. Well, to what extent does that really even impair their ability to do biology? Unless it's evolutionary biology, whose benefits are dubious. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to go into that. But yeah, that was just my thought process. And I need to end this video eventually. So usually when you do like presentations, you do speeches, you like try to have some sort of ending, some sort of climatic ending that summarizes everything. But when you're doing a stream of consciousness thing, it's not really appropriate. You just kind of have to just end it.